European Convention on Human Rights. And Article 10 states clearly that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but it also highlights that this freedom of expression shall not prevent states from introducing licensing requirements for broadcasters. And it also highlights that there can be restrictions if these are necessary in a democratic society. But we always have to keep in mind that whenever there is regulation, whenever there are restrictions, they have to be really necessary for the functioning of the media market. Another important document is the recommendation by the Council of Europe on media pluralism and diversity of media content. And it recommends countries to adopt a regulatory framework in order to guarantee media transparency and structural pluralism, as well as diversity in the content of the media. And it also highlights that such regulation, when it is adopted in the legal framework, shall not be used to interfere in the content of the media or to exert undue control of the media sector, but it has to be to achieve the goal of transparent media ownership. And this recommendation highlights a few aspects that governments can choose to make transparent. And this includes information concerning the persons and bodies participating in the structure of the media and the nature and extent of their participation. So the owners, including the beneficial owners of a media outlet, and how many shares they own. Information on the nature and extent of the interests held by these persons and bodies in other media enterprises or even in other sectors. So this recommendation provides room for having provisions that require the disclosure, for example, if the owners of a media company also own cable TV companies, if they own newspapers, if they own distribution companies, other companies in the media sector where there might be the question if there's a dominant position in the market. And it could also provide room to have further disclosure requirements about the assets that are held by the media owners. And then this provision also provides room to make transparent information on persons and bodies that are likely to exercise significant influence on the programming policy or the editorial policy of a media outlet. So this would be senior staff of the media outlet, but it could also be the major financiers of a media outlet. And then the recommendation also states that governments can choose to make information regarding support measures granted to the media public. So to make public the finances that are provided from the state, from public authorities to certain media outlets. Then we also have the Council of Europe's recommendation on the measures to promote media transparency. And this recommendation is fairly detailed, and it provides different guidance for states what kind of information can be made public in what way. So this is definitely a document that should be studied in more detail. But it provides a framework for Ukraine to disclose who are the people behind the companies that apply for broadcasting licenses. Another important treaty that applies to Ukraine, it came into force in 2009, is the European Convention on Transfrontier Television. And in regards to media ownership transparency, it sets a minimum standard. So it doesn't require the beneficial owners of television stations to be made public, but at least the names and addresses and core information about television stations. But in an explanatory note, it is stated that it is particularly necessary that information about the broadcaster is available to everyone, because the multiplication and diversification of program services on the one hand, and the transfrontier character of transmissions on the other, it is important that both states and viewers know who is responsible for what. Because television is not today a national matter, it's often international. Channels broadcast across country lines, and it is important that we can understand who is behind all the channels that you can receive in your country. Of course, with Ukraine moving towards the European Union, there's also an increasing relevance of EU regulation on the media sector, but in general, the European Union leaves it to the member states to regulate the media sector. The European Union only provides regulation to the extent as it concerns a media market across borders. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union also contains an article on freedom of speech and opinion. And the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement makes reference to Ukraine complying with the European Convention on Transfrontier Television, which I just referred to, and also with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive of the European Union. This directive basically sets very basic minimum standards in terms of media ownership transparency. It does not require that the owners are made transparent, but of course Ukraine can go much beyond what this minimum standard of the EU requires. Basically, this directive, which Ukraine should comply within 2 years after the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement coming into force, only requires that the name of a media service provider, its address, and the regulator that it is subject to, and some other details such as the contact information, a website, are made transparent. But again, Ukraine can go much beyond what this minimum standard requires. One case study I would like to talk about is Austria. Austria didn't have the problem of oligarchs owning television stations, but it had the problem of many powerful newspapers being owned by foundations and trusts, and nobody knew who was really behind these very powerful newspapers. So in 2011, after a lot of scandals, the Austrian parliament finally adopted changes to the Media Act, and it required that all media makes public their beneficial owners. So it does not apply only to broadcasters, but to any website, to any newspaper, to any magazine, to any radio station. Now there is no registration requirement for print media or online media in Austria, because that would be seen as a limitation of freedom of speech. So the media law only requires the proactive publication. So a media outlet has to publish its address, its owners, and all the levels of ownership structures, including trustee relationships on its website. And anybody has or should be able to look at this information on the media outlet's website, and if there is a suspicion that the media outlet does not comply with the media law, the person can go to the police and file an administrative complaint, and violations are published with up to 20,000 euros. But the Austrian case, so there's no regulator that monitors print or online media, but I think it provides a useful approach because it is very light-handed. It doesn't create a lot of bureaucracy, and it doesn't create a lot of restrictions.